Thanks for coming out today. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with me, and I appreciate that. My name is Jason Wong, and I'm here today to talk about introducing inclusive behaviors into an engineering organization. So, let's get to it. Back around mid-2017, I stepped into a new role, helping to oversee a group of about 35 engineers in New York City. Just to give you all a sense of what that group looked like, of our 35 engineers, 5 were women, 4 were Hispanics/Latinx. We had 1 LGBTQ engineer on the team and no black engineers. And I think a lot of folks will look at this team and say, hey, you know, that's not bad on the diversity front. But if we look at the numbers of New York City, you can see that actually it is pretty bad, and we lagged behind significantly. And so I thought it was incumbent upon me to bring about some change. But why now? This company was only 2 years old at the time, and like any startup, it had a ton of business challenges. And no one would have really called us out if we had deferred our diversity and inclusion efforts. And now it's the time we cue the avalanche of data that shows why this is important. So here we go, hang on. Out of the McKinsey company, there's this report that says companies in the top quartile of gender diversity on executive teams were 21% more likely to outperform on profitability and 27% more likely to have superior value creation. From the Boston Consulting Group, companies with above average total diversity had both 19 percentage points higher innovation revenues and 9 percentage points higher EBIT margins. This is out of University of North Carolina. Companies with higher diversity announce on average 2 extra products a year. Let's keep going. Catalyst research. Companies with the highest percentage of women board directors outperform those with the least by 53%. Out of Harvard Business Review, venture capital firms that increased their proportion of female partner hires by 10% saw, on average, a 1.5% spike in overall fund returns each year and had a 9.7% more profitable exits. And finally, at a first round, companies with a female founder performed 63% better than their investments with all male founding teams. So why now? Well, I can honestly say that I don't think I've ever worked on any product launch or feature that has had this type of impact on a company. But if you're still not convinced, let's take a quick detour, and I'll talk about me for a little bit. Prior to joining this company, I had spent about 7 years at a popular e-commerce startup. I joined the company when it was about 100 folks. I saw it grow to over 1,000. I started managing a team of 3 engineers that grew into an organization of 85 plus. During that time, we went from 0% women in my organization to about 35% women/non-binary folks. And in my last year there, we actually achieved a 50% hiring ratio between men and women and non-binary hires. This was all very focused on just one aspect of diversity, and it was not easy. So, why now? Well, having been through this before, I can tell you with certainty that there is no easier time than right now. Literally, today is the very moment, at this very moment, is as easy as it's gonna get. It'll be easier today than tomorrow, next week, next month, or even next year. Great. So let's get started. I really thought this would be super easy, right? I've done this before, not a problem. But it wasn't. I kept running into this what is water problem, right? Where I'd become so accustomed to having the knowledge and the norms of inclusivity in our workplace that I couldn't properly describe what was profoundly, obviously wrong in our new environment. And it worked both ways. Conversely, marginalizing behaviors are so embedded in the fabric of our society that it was difficult for others to see what I was trying to point out to them. But there's something that I did know, and like Kate Houston says, inclusion had to come first. One of the questions I get most often when I talk to tech leaders is, how do I hire more women? But there's a secret that everyone needs to know about this, and that hiring is the easiest part. The great thing about the past 5 years is that there now exist a huge number of self-identifying talent pools and affinity groups. Code 2040, Dev Color, Hire Tech Ladies, Lesbians Who Tech, Shift.org. You name the demographic, there's someone there looking to connect you to them. But what happens after you hire them? And it turns out what happens after you hire them is probably the same thing that's happening in your companies right now. Pay inequity, career stagnation, harassment. In this recent study by the New York Times, a third of men said that they had done something in the past year that could be construed as objectionable behavior or sexual harassment. Assault. So show of hands real quick, who here works at a company with 10 or more men? Right. So this is not abstract. This is a real threat. So these terrible things are no secret, right? There's all these studies that show that they are real. We are just reluctant to acknowledge them. And these terrible things happen disproportionately to our underrepresented groups, and they know it. And so for me, inclusion had to come first, because if I was going to be successful, I knew that it was on us to demonstrate that our workplace was safe, welcoming, and deserving of the talent. And so I had to get more systematic about my efforts here. And whenever I need to create clarity around something, I have a particular tool in my toolbox. And that's a vision, mission, strategy statement. So here's the one that I used. Vision, a workplace where people of all identities and experiences are understood, appreciated, and fully included in the community, and where equitable treatment and outcomes prevail. Does anyone here work at American University? All right, cool. If you did, it might look familiar because I totally stole it from you all. Which is a great time to point out that just like writing software, you don't have to originate everything yourself. There's a huge community out here that is supportive and looking to help you, and there's this great thing called the internet that is full of resources. Mission, create a company of allies. Allies in general are folks who have privilege and use that privilege to enable access and opportunity for those with less privilege. They're important for all sorts of reasons, but for me, this mission was the right one because it meant that regardless of if I was successful, it wouldn't matter if I was at the company or not, inclusion would continue on at the company. And finally, strategy. Build awareness, provide education, and affect behavioral change. Having this vision, mission, strategy statement made things a lot easier for me. Not only did I have good mouth words to describe what I was trying to do, but it also really kept me focused, right? Anytime I got stuck on something, I could take a look at my strategy and say, hey, what's the awareness piece that I'm gonna do this week? Or what's the education initiative we should put down for this quarter? So it really helped to sustain me. Beyond achieving the mission, I was really hopeful that the strategy would help us navigate 3 inflection points that I found to be common stumbling blocks. The first inflection point is not complicit to complicit. Most of us live our lives thinking that we're pretty good people, or at least inert enough not to be actively causing harm to others. So the idea that we're complicit in perpetuating sexism, racism, and discrimination is really hard to take in. But we are all complicit in some way, right? And just like the stages of grief, getting to acceptance is key to moving on. So the question isn't whether we're complicit or not, but it's how complicit are we and what are we gonna do now that we know it. The second inflection point is believing in the lived experiences of others. Once we open ourselves up to hearing from different voices, the next phase is actually believing what we're hearing. Because we live in a world filled with bias, 2 people can do the exact same thing and end up with completely different outcomes. And so this inflection point is about getting to a point where the default is believing the stories and experiences that we're hearing, even if they run completely counter to our own. And the third is investing time and money. Talk is cheap. Lots of folks like to talk a big game, but when someone comes to you and says, hey, let's budget $25,000 for an employee resource group program this year, or let's divert engineering for the next 2 days to remove master-slave terminology from our code base, you will hesitate. And the question is, will you follow through? So the thing about these inflection points is it's not like you cross them once and you're done, right? You're going to encounter them over and over again as you go along your journey. You'll find one aspect of your you'll come to accept one aspect of your complicitness and then discover another. You'll begin to believe one set of lived experiences, but still be incredulous of someone else's. And so I really was hoping that this strategy would help us get good at moving through these inflection points, because we're going to be doing it a lot. So what did this strategy look like in action? Well, on the awareness front, the first thing I did was I introduced myself as the person responsible for diversity and inclusion for the engineering organization. I communicated this responsibility via email when I joined, and also every time I described my job function to others. So that meant interviewing candidates, meeting new people at the company, and onboarding new engineers. I just kept repeating it. I communicated our vision, mission, and strategy to the group. Leadership tip right here. A great way to build trust with your organization is saying you're going to do something and then doing it. So that's what I did here. It also served a couple other extra purposes as well. First is no one really likes surprise. So this was a way of giving folks a heads up that change was coming. And second, at the time, I was all strategy and no tactics. And so this was a way for me to invite folks in to be a part of the process. We discussed current events. I firmly believe that it's important to acknowledge the world as it's changing around us. Talking about issues that affect your underrepresented populations is a great way for them to feel seen and serves as a great awareness opportunity for those with enough privilege not to be affected. So one of the stories that came out during that time was binary capital. And when this story broke, I talked to my engineering organization to let them know that this is not unusual in tech. And I thanked the women who came forward. And I used this opportunity to dispel the myth of false accusations. That people who often speak up pay a terrible price in lost job opportunities, social alienation, and threats of physical retaliation. I wanted my organization to know that what these women did was an act of bravery. Shortly after that story came out, the Google memo came out. And this one took a little bit more nuance. I needed to find a way to talk about the incident without creating a venue for the contents of the memo. Right? So I spoke about the weaponization of ideological diversity and the harms of using public forums to debate the individual worth of people. This particular story also broke over the weekend, and I let my org know that many of us have spent our off time dealing with the fallout for this, and so please be kind to one another in face of that. These are definitely not the typical types of communications you expect out of your engineering leadership team, but that's the point. My brain came up with so many reasons not to do this. Neither of these events directly impacted our business or our organization. I could have easily waited until someone brought it up before I responded. But I had to consider that all my uncertainties about this were trying to rationalize the norm. And they weren't really couched in logic or legitimate concerns, but just in a fear and avoidance of standing out. Shortly after those two stories broke, I asked my team to start diversifying their social networks. I provided them a list of underrepresented minorities on tech and asked them to follow 20 new voices. The goal here was to shake up their archetype of what engineers looked and sounded like, and to bring the voices of marginalized folks into their everyday lives. And finally, on this front, we celebrated wins, right? Changes over time can be subtle and difficult to identify. So anytime we moved to create a more inclusive workplace, I made sure we recognized it and gave a shout out to the folks who were involved. And that was the awareness front. A lot of this felt like just speaking into the ether. And I'll be honest, it didn't feel like folks were jumping on board right away. But the key to any successful communication plan is repetition. And it might not land the first time or even the fifth. But if you keep iterating on it, eventually it will. Education. So this is the piece of the strategy that I struggled with the most, actually. Inclusion as a topic runs super deep. And I am no expert. Universities give out degrees in this stuff. So who was I to think that I could actually teach it properly? So one of the tactics I employed was outsourcing. I created a reading list of materials that I could refer folks to whenever they came to me curious about learning more. Here's mine. It is very incomplete and skews highly towards gender diversity because that's where my background was. And I'm still learning how to branch out into other areas of diversity. And we also did allyship training. Who here has a brown bag program or a lunch and learn type thing at their company? Great. So I just grabbed a slot when we talked about allyship. I did a talk largely based off of the work by Toria Gibbs and Ian Malpass, formerly of Etsy. We talked about what allyship was, why it was important, and what were the effective behaviors of allies. That's about as far as I got on the education front. Like I said, there's not a lot of meat on the bone. And I knew I had a lot, and the benefit of having that vision, mission, strategy is that I knew I had a lot more work to do here. And finally, affecting behavioral change. At the end of the day, this is the piece of the strategy that really matters. How do we move from inclusion theater to inclusion reality? What are the actual changes that we're going to make in our environment to create a more inclusive workspace, and how are we going to hold ourselves accountable? This is where the discomfort level gets dialed up to 11. So the first thing we tried to do was improve discourse. Anytime I heard or saw something that was exclusionary, I pulled that person aside and had a conversation with them. Thankfully, thankfully, nothing I witnessed warranted a public response. I've definitely been a witness in those situations. Specifically, I talked to people about jokes they made about the LGBTQ community, comments in Slack channels that came at the expense of women, and insensitive word choice. At first, I did this as a solo endeavor, and eventually I rolled my managers into this effort as well. We weren't perfect on this, and we missed quite a few opportunities to give feedback, but we definitely put the effort in. We removed racist Slack emojis, specifically emojis that represented white power that were being used in a comical way. As absurd as it sounds, it is surprisingly easy to make the excuse of, well, he didn't mean to propagate white power, so we'll let it slide. One of the most difficult things about this work is that the intent is often not there, but the impact is nevertheless, right? You don't mean to get into a car accident, but at the end of the day, your car is still busted. So we removed these emojis. We changed how we named things. We didn't have issues with master-slave terminology in our code base, but we did have a project that was named in a gendered way. Shortly after I joined, we launched this project called Log Lady, and it was, as you'd guess, part of a log aggregation platform. And this sounds innocuous and cute and endearing, but when we anthropomorphize our technology, we bring with us our subtle and not so subtle biases. And so, for example, you can imagine bringing Log Lady to an operational review, right? And someone asking, well, what happens when Log Lady goes down? Or you're baking a quiche on a quiet Sunday morning, your pager goes off, you jump online, Log Lady is flailing, you spend an hour fixing it, you come back and your quiche is burned, and you say, Log Lady, that effing bee. We talk a lot about death by 1,000 cuts. In this line of work, Mecca Okereke has this concept of inclusion debt. And if talking about your technology leads to racking up debt, you're going to be in trouble, because technology organizations talk about their technology all the time. So for me, I'd rather that we avoid this situation entirely. As a management cohort, we started a quarterly practice of analyzing pay across our team. Compensation calibration is great for all sorts of reasons. In this context, we were concerned with primarily two vectors. One was pay discrepancies. Were we giving equal pay for equal work? And the second was career progression. Were our folks in underrepresented groups moving through the career ladder at the same rate as their non-underrepresented peers? If you're lucky, you will only find minor pay discrepancies amongst your folks. But those discrepancies can lead up to larger ones very quickly. And if you're not so lucky, I've had, in my experience, pay gaps which were in the $20,000 to $40,000 range. And the pro tip I have here for y'all is when you do find these pay gaps, the only effective remedy is to make people whole immediately. Anything else leads to a perpetual game of catch-up and years of continued pay inequity. We wrote inclusivity into our career ladder. We made it a point of performance. The first thing we did is we took a stance and said, we will only promote people based on demonstrated performance and not on potential. We set expectations at every single level. So our junior engineers were responsible for learning about and contributing to our inclusive culture, right? As they became more senior, they picked up mentorship and sponsorship responsibilities. Our managers were on the hook for recruiting and retaining diverse teams, and our directors were responsible for creating policies and procedures that resulted in equitable outcomes. A bullet point in a career ladder doesn't mean a whole lot unless you're going to enforce it. But it does give you the opportunity to have that conversation every time someone's up for promotion or a compensation adjustment. And if y'all are thinking about doing this for your own teams, there's this great post here by Chelsea Troy about how to evaluate inclusive behaviors. I found this after I rolled out our career ladder, but if I had to do it again, I would definitely incorporate a lot of these ideas. And finally, we started interviewing for inclusion. And we weren't demure about it either. We asked folks point blank, how have you or how would you contribute to an inclusive environment? And we're motivated again by a couple of reasons. The first is that if it was in our career ladder, and we're going to be evaluating our folks against this in the long term, it stood to reason that we should be sussing this information out in our interview. And the second thing is, one of the huge injustices of this work right now is that we're placing the education of the majority as a burden on the minority. And so if we continue to let folks in who are not familiar with diversity and inclusion, the development and the education of those folks would be a tax that was borne on our underrepresented groups, and I wasn't willing to let that happen. So like I said earlier, this is really uncomfortable work. And I wish I could say that I acted with confidence and deftness in all these cases, but I can't. With almost every single one of these actions, despite knowing my principles and motivations, I still hesitated. I still wondered whether I was making too big of a deal out of something, or if what I was asking was a legitimate use of someone's time. To be clear, asking an engineer to spend 2 days renaming a project that's already working perfectly fine is an uncomfortable thing to do. Sometimes those deliberations took me 5 to 10 minutes, sometimes hours or even days before I followed through. And I'm telling you this not because I think there's a gray area here, but because I want you all to know that in the moment, you may rarely feel certainty. So everything I've described so far took place over the course of about 5 months. And there were still plenty of things left to do. And that's one of the things that makes this difficult, right? There's always something more to do. But changing norms is not easy. Removing sexism, discrimination, and racism is super difficult. For so many of us, exclusionary behaviors are ingrained in our natures, right? It's that wink you give when you're crossing the street. It's that casual comment in the hallway. It's that off-color joke you tell at parties that gets a polite laugh. But fairness and equity do not happen on their own. It is not a natural state of being. And this is the challenge. We're trying to create a new normal, one in which equitable treatment and fair outcomes prevail. And I don't know about you all, but creating a new normal has been the promise of tech for as long as I've been a part of it. My job didn't exist when I was born. Senior director of a web company was not a thing, right? And I'm incredibly lucky that I live in a time where something that I love to do is in high demand and pays extraordinarily well. The arbitrariness of these coincidences is not lost on me, and it guts me that not everyone has been able to participate in the riches of this movement. And that my time in this industry would be marked as one that enabled a tech landscape largely written by white men and for white men. There's a coach that's saying that goes, you only have to get 1% better every day. And if you can find a way to do that, at the end of 100 days, you'll be 100% better. Every time I hear this quote, I think, maybe coach didn't want to get into the intricacies of compound interest. It hangs you up, you have to explain it's 70 days and not 100 days. But whether you've been struggling with this, with getting started on inclusion, or you're well on your way, I hope there's something in this talk today that has helped you find your 1% for today. And if not, please find me at office hours. I'm more than happy to talk to you all. That's all I got for you. Thank you very much. Have a good day.